30 years after an 8-year-old girl disappeared while walking to retrieve an umbrella, detectives knocked on the door of a quiet trailer in rural Indiana. Before investigators could even finish asking why they were there, the man inside uttered two chilling words: April Tinsley. For 3 decades, the killer had lived among the same community he terrorized. He had taunted police, threatened children, and believed he would never be caught. But one mistake made years after the murder would eventually expose a secret he had carried since 1988. This is the story of the little girl who never came home, and the investigation that refused to die. If you enjoy true crime documentaries and real investigations, subscribe to Real Crime Pulse and turn on notifications for more cases built from the record. Long before her name became associated with one of Indiana's most haunting murder cases, April Marie Tinsley was simply a little girl who loved life, loved her family, and looked forward to the simple joys that filled her days. She had bright blue eyes, curly blonde hair, and a shy smile that friends and relatives would remember for decades. To the people who knew her, she was not a headline or a case file. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister, and a child whose future seemed full of endless possibilities. Born on March 18, 1980, April had recently celebrated her 8th birthday. Her mother, Janet Tinsley, often spoke about how she had always dreamed of having a blue-eyed girl with curly blonde hair. When April was born, that dream became reality. She was a second-grade student at Fairfield Elementary School in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and she enjoyed the ordinary things that made childhood special. She loved shopping trips, sleepovers at her grandparents' house, and spending time with friends in the neighborhood. April also sang in the children's choir at Faith United Methodist Church. Family members remembered her as a sweet child, who enjoyed being around people and who brought happiness wherever she went. Nothing about that spring of 1988 suggested that tragedy was approaching. Friday, April 1, 1988, was Good Friday. Schools were closed, giving children throughout Fort Wayne an opportunity to enjoy the beginning of spring. The weather was pleasant during the afternoon, and April was outside with 2 friends near West William Street. Like countless children across America, they spent the day laughing, playing, and enjoying their freedom. As the afternoon went on, light rain began to fall. Earlier in the day, April had left her umbrella at a friend's house around the corner. It was not far away, and retrieving it seemed like a simple task. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, she told her friends she was going to get the umbrella and that she would be right back. Those would become some of the final words anyone remembered hearing from her. Her friends waited for her return. Minutes passed. Then more time passed. Eventually, they assumed she had gone home and continued with their day. No one realized anything was wrong, but somewhere nearby, according to witness statements later provided to investigators, a disturbing scene unfolded. A resident reported seeing a white man, believed to be in his 30s, forcing a young girl matching April's description into an older blue pickup truck. At the time, no one knew that the brief encounter might hold the key to understanding what had happened. Back at home, Janet Tinsley expected her daughter to return by around 4 o'clock. When April failed to arrive, concern quickly turned into fear. She went outside and located the 2 friends who had been playing with April earlier. They told her about the umbrella and explained that they had not seen April since she left. The little girl who promised she would be right back had vanished as evening approached, and every passing minute brought more uncertainty. Janet contacted police and reported her 8-year-old daughter missing. What began as an ordinary spring afternoon in Fort Wayne was suddenly becoming every parent's worst nightmare. And nobody yet understood that the search for April Tinsley would last far longer than anyone could have imagined. As darkness settled over Fort Wayne on April 1, 1988, panic had already begun spreading through the Tinsley family. 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley had disappeared without warning, and with each passing hour, the fear that every parent dreads became more real. Janet Tinsley knew something was wrong. April was not the type of child to wander off without telling anyone. She had simply gone to retrieve an umbrella from a friend's house nearby. It should have taken only minutes. Instead, evening arrived with no sign of her. Police were contacted and officers quickly began searching the neighborhood. Family members, friends, and volunteers joined the effort. Everyone hoped there had been some misunderstanding. Perhaps April had gone to another friend's house. Perhaps someone had seen her and taken her somewhere safe. But as the hours passed, hope slowly gave way to fear. By the following day, the search had grown dramatically. Law enforcement officers worked throughout Fort Wayne, knocking on doors, interviewing neighbors, and following every lead they received. Volunteers joined the effort, desperate to bring the little girl home. Meanwhile, Janet and the rest of the family faced the unbearable uncertainty that accompanies every missing child case. They had no answers, no explanation, and no idea where April might be. Then, 3 days after she disappeared, the search came to a devastating end. On April 4, 1988, a jogger made a horrifying discovery near DeKalb County Road 68, outside Spencerville, Indiana, approximately 20 miles north of Fort Wayne. There, in a water-filled ditch, lay the body of 8-year-old April Tinsley. The news sent shockwaves throughout the community. Investigators soon determined that April had been abducted from the street and transported away from Fort Wayne. Evidence indicated she had been sexually assaulted before being murdered. The official cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Even experienced investigators were deeply affected by what they encountered. One of April's shoes remained on her body, while the other was discovered nearly 1,000 feet away. Nearby, investigators recovered a shopping bag containing items that immediately became important pieces of evidence. Most critical of all, biological evidence was collected from April's clothing. At the time, forensic DNA technology was still in its infancy. Scientists in 1988 simply lacked the tools needed to create a usable profile from the small amount of material recovered. But crime scene technicians made an important decision. They preserved everything. No one knew that the evidence collected that day would remain crucial for decades to come. Back in Fort Wayne, grief spread throughout the city. Local radio stations established reward funds and helped cover funeral expenses. Residents came together to support the devastated Tinsley family. Strangers who had never met April mourned alongside those who loved her most. Just days earlier, she had been singing in her church choir and celebrating her 8th birthday. Now Faith United Methodist Church held a memorial service for the little girl whose life had been stolen far too soon. But amid the sorrow, another mystery haunted investigators. April had left home to retrieve an umbrella. Despite exhaustive searches of the crime scene and the 20-mile route between Fort Wayne and Spencerville, the umbrella she set out to collect was never found. For detectives, that missing umbrella became one more unanswered question in a case already filled with heartbreak. As the funeral ended and the community tried to process the unimaginable, investigators faced a reality no one wanted to accept. Somewhere in Indiana, the person responsible for April Tinsley's murder was still free, and the hunt to find him was only beginning. In the days following April Tinsley's murder, investigators faced enormous pressure. An 8-year-old girl had been abducted in broad daylight, taken miles away from home and killed. Fear spread quickly across Fort Wayne. Parents who had once allowed their children to play outside suddenly kept them close. Neighbors watched unfamiliar vehicles with suspicion, and detectives understood one painful reality. If they failed to identify the killer quickly, he might disappear forever. The response was immediate. More than 250 Fort Wayne police officers joined the investigation. Volunteers assisted with searches. Tips poured in from concerned residents. Every phone call was taken seriously. Every possible lead was examined. Early in the investigation, one man was arrested. Authorities believed they might have found the person responsible. But as the case moved through the legal system, the evidence failed to support a conviction and he was eventually acquitted. Investigators were forced back to the beginning. Meanwhile, the nation became aware of April's story. The case appeared on television programs including America's Most Wanted and Crime Watch Daily. Thousands of additional tips arrived from around the country. Detectives chased every possibility, interviewed countless individuals, and reviewed mountains of information. Nothing led to the killer. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit became involved. Specialists developed a profile of the person they believed was responsible. According to their analysis, the offender was likely a white male who had been in his late 20s or early 30s at the time of the crime. He was probably someone embedded within the local community, rather than a transient passing through town. Years later, investigators would discover that profile had been remarkably accurate. Unfortunately, it did not identify anyone. As forensic science improved during the 1990s and early 2000s, the biological evidence recovered from April's clothing was submitted into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. Detectives hoped advances in technology would finally provide the answer they had been seeking, but every search produced the same result. No match. The man responsible had never been arrested for another crime that required his DNA to be entered into the system. As far as the database was concerned, he simply did not exist. The years continued passing. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited the case. Old boxes filled with reports moved from one desk to another. But despite the passage of time, nobody forgot April Tinsley. One retired detective kept her photograph on his desk at home. Even after leaving the force, he never stopped thinking about the little girl whose murder had haunted him for decades. Meanwhile, unknown to investigators, the man responsible had remained close. John D. Miller was living quietly in Grable, Indiana, only minutes away from where April's body had been discovered. He maintained an ordinary life. He held jobs. He blended into the community. He had no criminal record. No one had submitted his DNA. No witness had ever identified him. His name had never appeared in a significant tip. For 30 years, he remained invisible. But perhaps the most disturbing fact of all was this: the killer himself refused to let the case die. While detectives worked leads that led nowhere, while generations of officers devoted themselves to finding justice for April, the person responsible was watching. He was reading the news. He was following the investigation. And eventually, he would begin communicating with the community in ways that terrified Fort Wayne once again. Because for reasons investigators could not understand, the man who had escaped justice seemed to enjoy reminding everyone that he was still out there. And soon, he would make sure nobody forgot it. As the years passed after April Tinsley's murder, the investigation slowly transformed into a cold case. Leads dried up, tips became less frequent, and many feared the person responsible might never be identified. But while detectives continued searching for answers, someone else was paying close attention: the killer himself. For 2 years after April's death, there was silence. No communication, no new crimes connected to the case, nothing that pointed investigators toward a suspect. Then, in May 1990, something disturbing appeared in Grable, Indiana. On a barn located between Fort Wayne and the area where April's body had been found, someone had written a chilling message in crayon. "I kill 8-year-old April M. Tinsley. Did you find her other shoe? Haha. I will kill again." Investigators immediately recognized the significance of one particular detail. The message mentioned April's missing shoe. That information had never been released to the public. Only the killer and the investigators working the case knew that one of April's shoes had been found nearly 1,000 feet from her body. Whoever wrote the message had knowledge that could only come from being present. For detectives, it was both a breakthrough and a nightmare. They knew the person responsible was still nearby, but they had no idea who he was. Years passed, the investigation continued, but the person behind the message remained unidentified. Then something strange happened. The messages stopped. For 14 years, there was silence. Some members of the community believed the killer had died or moved away. Others hoped he had finally disappeared. They were wrong. In May 2004, fear returned to Fort Wayne. 7-year-old Emily Higgs discovered a plastic bag attached to her bicycle. Soon, several more girls reported finding similar bags on their bikes. Another bag was found inside a mailbox. Each package contained disturbing items. There were handwritten notes, Polaroid photographs showing parts of a man's body, and used condoms. The notes contained horrifying threats. They claimed the writer was the same person, responsible for abducting, assaulting, and killing April Tinsley. They warned young girls that they were being watched and that they could become the next victims. Panic spread across Fort Wayne once again. Parents became terrified. Children were warned not to ride alone. Investigators rushed to examine the evidence. This time, forensic science had advanced dramatically. Laboratories were able to recover a complete DNA profile from the condoms found inside the plastic bags. Then came an incredible discovery. The DNA profile matched the biological evidence recovered from April Tinsley's murder in 1988. It was the same man. After 16 years, investigators finally had confirmation. The person threatening children in 2004 was the same person who had murdered 8-year-old April. But the celebration was short-lived. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS. Nothing, no match. The killer had never been arrested for a qualifying crime. He had no criminal history that placed his DNA into the system. Once again, detectives found themselves staring at a dead end. They possessed the killer's DNA. They knew he was alive. They knew he was still somewhere near Fort Wayne. And they knew he enjoyed terrifying people. Yet, despite having his genetic fingerprint sitting inside a database, they still had no name. Meanwhile, April's mother, Janet Tinsley, refused to let her daughter be forgotten. Year after year, she continued speaking publicly about April. She attended memorial events, participated in interviews, and fought to keep the case alive. For 30 years, she carried the same question in her heart: who had taken her little girl? And unknown to Janet, unknown to the detectives, and unknown to the entire community, the answer had been sitting quietly in a trailer in Gravel, Indiana. A man who believed he had beaten the system, a man who had no idea that a revolutionary new form of DNA investigation was about to change everything. By 2018, 30 years had passed since April Tinsley had disappeared while walking to retrieve an umbrella. 3 decades had come and gone. Children who had grown up fearing the unknown killer were now adults. Detectives who had worked the original investigation had retired. Some had begun to accept the painful possibility that the man responsible would never be identified. Then, another case changed everything. In California, investigators had used a revolutionary technique called genetic genealogy to identify the Golden State Killer. The breakthrough sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across America. Suddenly, cold cases that had remained unsolved for decades seemed solvable again. Investigators in Indiana immediately recognized the opportunity. They still had something incredibly valuable: the killer's DNA. Although the profile had failed to produce a match through CODIS, detectives hoped a different approach could finally provide answers. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in forensic genealogy, and genealogist C.C. Moore began building family trees from publicly available genetic information. The process was painstaking. Instead of searching for the killer directly, genealogists searched for distant relatives who had unknowingly submitted their DNA to genealogy databases. Piece by piece, family connections were identified. Branches were traced. Names were narrowed down. Eventually, investigators focused on a family that led them to 2 brothers. One of those names was John D. Miller. He lived in Gravel, Indiana, only a short distance from where April's body had been discovered 30 years earlier. Investigators were careful. They needed absolute certainty. A surveillance operation began. Detectives watched Miller's movements and waited for an opportunity to collect discarded DNA. According to investigators, Miller regularly threw away used condoms and tissues. Those items were retrieved and sent to the laboratory. The results were stunning. The DNA matched the evidence recovered from April Tinsley's body. It matched the DNA found on the threatening notes left on children's bicycles in 2004, and it matched the profile investigators had been chasing for 3 decades. After 30 years, they finally had a name. On July 15, 2018, investigators arrived at Miller's trailer in Gravel. What happened next shocked even veteran detectives. Before investigators had the chance to explain why they were there, Miller looked at them and said 2 words: April Tinsley. The detectives had not mentioned her name. According to court records, Miller immediately understood why they had come. During questioning, he confessed. He admitted seeing April walking alone on April 1, 1988. He admitted abducting her. He admitted taking her to his trailer. He admitted sexually assaulting and murdering the 8-year-old girl. He also admitted writing the messages on the barn in 1990 and leaving the threatening notes on children's bicycles in 2004. For 30 years, he had lived among the same community he terrorized. He had attended church. He had held jobs. He had blended into everyday life. And all the while, he believed he had escaped justice. But science had finally caught up with him. For detectives who had devoted years of their lives to the case, the arrest felt almost surreal. Some retired investigators openly wept. Others said they never thought they would see the day when April's killer would finally be identified. After 3 decades of dead ends, frustration and heartbreak, the impossible had happened. The man who thought he had beaten the system had finally been exposed. And for April's family, justice was now closer than it had ever been. On July 15, 2018, after 3 decades of unanswered questions, investigators finally arrested John D. Miller. For many people in Fort Wayne, the news felt almost impossible to believe. The man who had terrorized the community, taunted investigators, and threatened children had been living quietly just miles away the entire time. For April Tinsley's family, the arrest brought emotions that were difficult to describe. There was relief, there was disbelief, and there was sadness. Nothing could bring back the little girl who had been taken from them in 1988. No arrest could restore the birthdays, holidays, and milestones that April never had the chance to experience. But after 30 years, there was finally an answer. As prosecutors prepared the case for trial, they faced overwhelming evidence. More importantly, they had something investigators had never possessed before: a confession. According to court records, Miller admitted abducting April, sexually assaulting her, and murdering her. He admitted writing the message on the barn in 1990. He admitted leaving threatening notes on children's bicycles in 2004. He even acknowledged that he had followed news coverage over the years. Faced with the evidence against him, Miller chose not to take the case to trial. In May 2019, he pleaded guilty to murder, child molestation, and criminal confinement. For the Tinsley family, the guilty plea ended decades of uncertainty, but it also forced them to confront the painful reality of hearing details they had spent years trying to understand. During sentencing, April's mother, Janet Tinsley, addressed the man who had stolen her daughter's future. For 31 years, she had carried unimaginable grief. She had attended memorial services, spoken publicly about April, and refused to let her daughter's memory disappear. Through every setback, she had held on to hope that one day justice would come. Now, she stood face to face with the man responsible. Retired detectives who had spent years working the case attended the hearing. Some had devoted entire careers to finding April's killer. Many never thought they would live to see the day when the mystery was solved. The judge sentenced John D. Miller to 80 years in prison. For a man who had believed he would never be caught, it meant he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Years later, in 2025, Miller died in prison at the age of 72. But his death was never the true ending of the story. The real legacy belonged to April. Her case became one of the most important examples of how forensic genealogy could solve crimes once considered impossible. Detectives across the country pointed to the investigation as proof that evidence should never be forgotten, and that science continues to evolve. In Fort Wayne, memorials and tributes continue to honor the little girl whose life touched so many people. Though she was only 8 years old, her story changed criminal investigations forever, and perhaps that is what makes April Tinsley's story so remarkable. Killer believed time would protect him. He believed 30 years had erased his crimes. He believed he had gotten away with murder. But somewhere, inside evidence boxes stored for decades, the truth was waiting. And in the end, it was not forgotten, neither was April. If you enjoy true crime documentaries, subscribe to Real Crime Pulse and turn on notifications for more real investigations.